The last thing my best friend ever said to me wasn't a word. It was a laugh. A broken, empty sound that echoed in this cabin long after the fog had taken him. I brought him here to reconnect with the world, to pull him back from the edge. I didn't know I was just introducing him to the one that waits beneath it. This is not a story of survival. This is a confession, an explanation for the man I fed to the silence. And it all started with a list of rules tacked to a pantry door. The air in the cab of my truck was thick with the scent of cheap coffee and the promise of freedom. For the last 6 hours, the world had been a blur of asphalt and identical gas stations, but now Montana was finally showing off. Jagged, snow-dusted peaks clawed at a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Pine trees, dense and dark, carpeted the rolling foothills like a forgotten ocean. "You weren't kidding, Ethan," Caleb said from the passenger seat, his voice filled with a genuine awe that I hadn't heard from him in months. "This is vast." Caleb had a way of boiling things down to their most essential word. For the past year, his word had been gray. His world had been gray, his mood was gray, his future felt gray. The sudden, vibrant death of his father in a head-on collision had drained the color from his life, leaving behind a man who was just a ghost in his own skin. I'd hoped the raw, untamed color of this place could be a transfusion. My grandparents called it God's blind spot, I said, navigating a tight curve on the gravel road that was more pothole than path. A place so remote, even he forgets to look at it sometimes. He managed a weak smile. Comforting. It's meant to be. It's a place outside of everything. No cell service, no internet, no noise. Just wood, rock, and sky. The perfect place to unplug. Or the perfect place to get murdered by a guy in a hockey mask, he quipped. But the joke was hollow, a reflex from a time when he still had humor in him. "The only thing that's going to murder us is my grandfather's liquor cabinet. I think there's a bottle of scotch in there older than both of us combined." The cabin appeared suddenly, cresting a small hill. It wasn't a modern glass-walled monstrosity. It was the real thing. A dark timber structure built from the very trees it had replaced, with a wide, welcoming porch and a stone chimney that looked like it had been there since the dawn of time. It was smaller than I remembered, huddled against the immensity of the surrounding wilderness. It looked lonely. We parked, and the silence that greeted us was absolute. It wasn't just quiet. It was a physical presence, a weight in the air. The only sound was the crunch of our boots on the gravel and the whisper of the wind through the pines. Caleb took a deep breath, filling his lungs. "Okay," he said, a hint of his old self in his voice. "I get it. This is incredible." Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, dust, and pine needles. A fine layer of dust covered the heavy, rustic furniture. Faded photographs of my grandparents, stern, unsmiling people who looked as weathered as the mountains themselves, lined the mantelpiece. It was a time capsule, a museum of a life I'd only ever visited on summer holidays. For me, it was nostalgia. For Caleb, I hoped it would be a sanctuary. "Make yourself at home," I said, dropping our bags on the floor. "I'll get a fire going. It gets cold up here when the sun goes down, even in summer." As I worked on the fireplace, Caleb wandered through the small space, running his hand over the rough-hewn wooden walls. He was quiet, contemplative. I hoped it was a good sign. Maybe the silence was what he needed, a blank canvas to paint his thoughts on. He stopped in the small kitchenette. "Ethan, what's this?" I glanced over. He was standing in front of the pantry door, a narrow plank of wood darker than the rest. Tacked to it was a single sheet of yellowed paper, its corners curled with age. I'd completely forgotten about it. A cold, silly flicker of childhood fear, one I hadn't felt in 20 years, sparked in my chest. I quickly extinguished it. "Oh, that," I chuckled, getting to my feet and walking over. "That's just Grandma's crazy, part of the cabin's charm." Caleb squinted at the faded, spidery handwriting. "Rules for the fog?" "Yeah. She was always superstitious, used to tell me stories about the fog. Said it was different up here, that it wasn't just weather." My voice was light, mocking, but the memory of her dead serious tone as she'd explained it to me as a 5-year-old was unnervingly clear. "Let's hear 'em," Caleb said, a genuine spark of curiosity in his eyes. I cleared my throat, adopting a dramatic, spooky voice. I read the list aloud. My family has a cabin deep in Montana. We have 6 rules for when the fog rolls in. Rule 1. If the fog rolls in, get inside before you lose sight of the porch light. Caleb snorted. Okay, sensible enough. Don't get lost in the woods. I can get behind that. I continued, pointing to the next line. Rule 2. Lock all doors and windows. Do not open them for anyone or anything. Again, just good sense, he reasoned. We're in the middle of nowhere, bears, mountain lions, crazy hermits. Rule 3. Ignore any voices you hear, especially if they sound like your loved ones. He paused, a slight frown on his face. All right, that one's a little more specific. Audio hallucinations caused by atmospheric pressure. Infrasound. He was already trying to dissect it, to pin it to a board with the neat, clean pins of logic. That was Caleb. Everything had an explanation. Here's where it gets weird, I said, my voice losing some of its mocking tone. Rule 4. Cover all the mirrors in the house. Why? No idea. Maybe so the hockey mask guy can't sneak up behind you? I tried to joke, but it fell flat. The simple, declarative nature of the rule was unsettling. Rule 5. Keep the old radio on, tuned only to the static between stations. That's bizarre, Caleb admitted. White noise, to block out the voices from Rule 3. Maybe, I said, finally reading the last one. My throat felt a little dry. Rule 6. If you see tall silhouettes in the fog, do not look directly at them. They notice when they are noticed. We stood in silence for a moment after I finished. The cheerful afternoon sun streamed through the dusty windows, making the list on the door seem ridiculous, the product of an old woman's lonely, fraying mind. So, Caleb said, breaking the silence with a clap on my shoulder, your grandmother was basically the protagonist of a folk horror movie. That's amazing. He was smiling, truly smiling. The absurdity of it had amused him. You know, we have to do it. If it gets foggy, we have to follow the rules for the authentic experience. Yeah, sure, I laughed, the tension breaking. We'll play your little horror game. The rest of the afternoon was perfect. We got the fire roaring, cracked open a couple of beers and sat on the porch watching the sun begin its slow descent behind the western peaks. The mountains were painted in shades of orange and purple. We talked, really talked, for the first time in a long time. He spoke about his father, about the suffocating weight of grief and the feeling that he was watching his own life from a great distance. The vast, indifferent wilderness seemed to be listening, absorbing his pain without judgment. I felt like I had made the right decision. This was working. It was as the last sliver of sun vanished that I first noticed it, a wisp of white in the valley below us. A cloud, maybe, but it wasn't drifting. It was rising. Fog's rolling in, Caleb noted, his voice casual. I watched it. There was something unnatural about its speed. It wasn't a gentle mist creeping in. It was a tide of white surging up the mountainside, swallowing the dark pines whole. It moved with a purpose that made the hairs on my arms stand up. And then came the silence. One moment, the forest was alive with the gentle hum of insects and the distant call of a night bird. The next, there was nothing. A complete and total cessation of sound, as if a giant bell jar had been dropped over the mountain. The silence was heavier, more profound than before. It wasn't peaceful. It was predatory. Rule 1 flashed in my mind, unbidden. Get inside before you lose sight of the porch light. The fog was still a few hundred yards away, but it was moving fast. The single bare bulb of the porch light, which had just flickered on in the gathering dusk, suddenly seemed like the most important beacon in the world. Let's head in, I said, my voice tighter than I intended. Caleb looked at me, a playful glint in his eye. You're not actually taking that list seriously, are you? Just getting cold, I lied, standing up. The fog was a solid, churning wall now, maybe 50 yards from the tree line. It was utterly silent. It didn't hiss or whisper. It just came. I felt a primal childhood terror grip me. It was an instinct, a genetic memory passed down from some ancestor who knew to fear the things that move in the dark. Ethan, seriously, what's the rush? Caleb said, remaining seated. Caleb, get inside, now. My voice had a hard edge he wasn't used to. It surprised us both. He saw the look on my face, the genuine irrational fear, and his smile faded. He sighed, shaking his head, but he stood up. We walked into the cabin, and I shut the heavy oak door behind us. The sound of the deadbolt sliding home was unnervingly loud in the oppressive silence. I walked through the small cabin, locking the other door and checking the latches on all the windows. "Dude, you're really committing to the bit," Caleb said, trying to lighten the mood. "Just humor me," I muttered, my heart hammering against my ribs. I felt foolish, childish, but I also felt a deep, unshakable certainty that I had done the right thing. The fog hit the cabin. We didn't see it as much as we felt it. The light outside the windows dimmed, turning the world into a murky, grey nothingness. The cabin, which had felt cozy and nostalgic moments before, now felt like a raft adrift on a vast, featureless ocean. We were completely, utterly isolated. "Well, this is atmospheric," Caleb said, his voice a little strained. He walked over to the main window and peered out. "Can't see a thing. It's like the world just disappeared." I followed the rules. I found a dusty old tablecloth and draped it over the large, ornate mirror above the fireplace. I found the small portable radio on a bookshelf, its plastic yellowed with age. I turned the dial, the speaker crackling to life. I spun it past snippets of country music and political talk shows until I found what I was looking for. The harsh, empty hiss of static. I left it on. A quiet, shushing sound that did little to fill the suffocating silence. Caleb watched me, a mixture of pity and amusement on his face. "You're actually doing it all, covering the mirrors, the static. What's next? Building a salt circle?" "Shut up," I said, but without any real heat. I felt exposed, my childhood fears laid bare. We sat in the two worn armchairs by the fire, the static hissing from the radio, the world outside erased by white. We tried to talk, but the conversation was stilted. The oppressive atmosphere had seeped through the walls. Every creak of the old cabin made us jump. The silence from outside was a constant screaming pressure against the eardrums. It felt like holding your breath, waiting for something to happen. And then it did. Tap, tap, tap. A soft, gentle knocking at the main door. We both froze, looking first at the door, then at each other. My blood ran cold. "Probably just a branch," Caleb whispered, though he didn't sound convinced. The wind had died completely. There were no branches moving. The knocking came again, same rhythm, same gentle pressure. Tap, tap, tap. Rule 2. Do not open them for anyone, or anything. "Who the hell could be out there?" Caleb breathed, his eyes wide. "No one," I said, my voice a strangled whisper. "There's no one out there." We waited, hearts pounding in the quiet. The fire crackled, the radio hissed, and then a voice came from the other side of the door, a voice that was calm, familiar, and utterly impossible. "Son?" the voice asked, filled with a gentle confusion. "I had an accident down the road, the fog. I got turned around. Can you let me in?" I stared at Caleb. His face, illuminated by the flickering firelight, had gone completely pale, a waxy, bloodless mask of pure shock. His mouth was slightly agape. He looked at me, his eyes screaming a question, a denial, a plea for this not to be real. Because I had never met his father. But I knew from the pictures, from the stories, from the way Caleb's entire world had shattered when he died, that the voice on the other side of that door, clear as day, was the voice of Richard Caleb Thorne, a man who had been pronounced dead at the scene of a fiery car crash over a year ago. The world no longer had rules. Our reality had just been broken, and the thing outside was patiently waiting for us to open the door. If you need to know what was truly knocking, and whether we survived the night with our sanity intact, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell. The silence out here is deep, and you won't want to be left alone in it. The investigation into what lies within the fog is only just beginning. The world shrank to the space of a single, indrawn breath. The voice, Richard Thorne's voice, hung in the air between us, a phantom limb suddenly restored. It was warm, patient, and laced with a fatherly concern that was so perfect, so authentic, it felt like a physical blow. Outside, the swirling miasma was no longer just weather. It was a stage, and something was performing a meticulous, heartbreaking play just for Caleb. Caleb's face was a canvas of warring emotions. Shock, disbelief, a desperate, irrational flicker of hope that was the most terrifying thing of all. His lips parted, and a single choked syllable escaped. "Dad?" "No," I hissed, my voice ablaze in the quiet. I grabbed his arm, my grip tight enough to hurt. "Caleb, no, look at me. It's not him." "How do you know?" He shot back, his eyes wet with unshed tears. He tried to pull his arm away, his gaze fixed on the door as if he could see through the wood. "It sounds exactly like him. Ethan, what if it's a miracle? What if he's what?" I demanded, keeping my voice a low, urgent whisper. "Lost? After a year? After a funeral? After a closed casket, Caleb?" The words were cruel, but they had to be. Hope was the enemy now. Hope was the key that would turn the lock. From outside, the voice spoke again, its tone shifting to one of gentle reassurance. "Cal Pal, I know this is confusing. Just open the door. I'm so cold, son. I just want to come home." Cal Pal. The nickname was a surgical strike. Caleb flinched as if he'd been shot. I felt the muscles in his arm go slack, then tense up with a resolve that terrified me. He was going to the door. I put myself between him and it, planting my feet. "You can't," I said, my own voice shaking. "Rule 3. You ignore them. Especially them." My grandmother wasn't just a superstitious old woman, Caleb. She was scared. I never understood it until now. This is what she was scared of. "It's a trick," he stammered, though he was trying to convince himself, not me. "It's a recording. Someone is doing this. A prank. A horrible, sick prank." "Who? Who followed us out here into the middle of nowhere, knew your childhood nickname, knew the sound of your dead father's voice, and then somehow queued it up the second this unnatural fog arrived? Does that sound logical to you?" The voice outside seemed to sense his doubt. It changed tactics. "I remember that last fishing trip," it said, its tone now wistful, filled with a crushing sadness. "At Flathead Lake, you were so frustrated you weren't catching anything. I told you to be patient, that the big ones always wait. And then you hooked that monster trout, remember? Your face, I've never been so proud." Caleb made a sound, a wounded, guttural sob that was torn from the deepest part of his soul. He shoved me aside, not with anger, but with the full weight of his grief. "I have to see," he rasped, his hand reaching for the deadbolt. I tackled him. We went down in a heap on the dusty floor, a clumsy, desperate tangle of limbs. He was stronger than me, fueled by a year of repressed agony, but I was fueled by a fresh, electric terror that was far more potent. "It's not him," I yelled, pinning his arms. "The rules are real. We follow the rules or we die." "Let me go," he roared, struggling beneath me. "What if you're wrong? What if I'm leaving my father to die out there all over again?" That was its true genius. It wasn't just mimicking the dead. It was weaponizing love and regret. It was twisting the knife of his trauma. For what felt like an eternity, we fought on the floor of that cabin, two friends locked in a battle over the nature of reality. The only sounds were our ragged breaths, the hiss of the radio, and the crackle of the fire. Outside, the voice fell silent. It didn't need to speak anymore. It had planted the seed of doubt, and now it was just waiting for it to bloom. Finally, the fight went out of Caleb. He went limp beneath me, his body racked with shuddering sobs. I cautiously rolled off him, my own body trembling with adrenaline. He curled into a ball on the floor, his face buried in his hands, and wept. I retreated to the other side of the room, my back against the cold stone of the fireplace, and watched the door, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The night stretched on, a vast, silent eternity. The voice did not return, the knocking did not resume, but its absence was somehow worse. The silence was now charged, heavy with the knowledge of what it was capable of. We were no longer just isolated. We were being held hostage by an enemy that knew our most profound weaknesses. Hours passed. The fire burned down to glowing embers. Caleb eventually uncurled himself and moved to one of the armchairs, pulling a thick wool blanket around his shoulders. He didn't speak. He just stared into the dying fire, his face pale and hollow. The chasm that had opened between us was immense. He had wanted to believe in a miracle, and I had forced him to believe in a monster. I wasn't sure which was worse. I tried to stay awake, to keep watch, but my eyelids felt like lead weights. The emotional and physical exhaustion was overwhelming. I must have drifted off because I was jolted awake by a change in the room's ambient sound. The static. It had shifted. I sat bolt upright, every nerve ending screaming. The steady, random shh of the radio had changed. It was still static, but now it had a rhythm, a cadence. It was a soft, rhythmic pulsing. Hiss, shush. Hiss, shush. Hiss, shush. It sounded like breathing, slow, deep, and impossibly close. I looked at the radio. The small antique device sat on the bookshelf, an inert piece of plastic and wires. Yet the sound emanating from it was organic, alive. It was as if the machine itself were drawing in and expelling air. I felt a wave of nausea. Rule 5 hadn't said the static was a shield. It just said to keep it on. What if it wasn't meant to block sound out? What if it was a beacon, a way for them to listen in? Caleb was still in his chair, seemingly asleep, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the blanket. He heard it too. The rhythmic static continued for what could have been minutes or an hour. Time had lost its meaning. Then, as suddenly as it began, it stopped, reverting to the normal, chaotic hiss. We didn't acknowledge it. We didn't dare. To speak of it would be to make it more real, and it was already far too real. It was sometime in the deep, dead hours of the morning that Caleb finally moved. He stood up, his joints creaking in the cold air, and walked towards the small hallway that led to the bathroom. His movements were stiff, robotic. "Caleb?" I whispered. He didn't answer. He just disappeared into the darkness of the hall. I heard the bathroom door creak open, then shut. I listened, my ears straining against the static. I heard the faucet run, the sound of water splashing. He was grounding himself, washing his face, trying to feel something real in a world that had become an impossible nightmare. Then I remembered. The mirror. There was a small, simple mirror inside the medicine cabinet in the bathroom. In my haste, I had only covered the large one over the fireplace, a stupid, trivial oversight that now felt like a catastrophic failure. Rule 4. Cover all the mirrors. I was about to get up to call out to him, but a paralyzing fear kept me pinned to the chair. What would I even say? Don't look at yourself? How do you explain that without sounding completely insane? He was in there for a long time. Too long. When he finally emerged from the hallway, he was different. The profound grief on his face had been replaced by something else. A quiet, unnerving emptiness. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out, his insides scooped clean, leaving only a fragile shell behind. He walked back to his chair and sat down without a word. He didn't look at me. He just stared at the floor, his hands resting limply in his lap. "You okay?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He nodded slowly, a single jerky motion, but he wasn't okay. The atmosphere in the cabin had grown colder, sharper. It was the difference between being in a cage with a sleeping predator and being in one where the predator had just opened its eyes. The first hint of dawn did nothing to help. The murky grey light that filtered through the windows only revealed that the fog had not receded. It was as thick and impenetrable as ever, pressing in on all sides. There would be no morning reprieve. There would be no escape. I couldn't stand the inaction anymore. I had to see. I had to know what was out there. I crept to the main window, the one Caleb had been staring at when he tried to prove me wrong. I told myself I was just checking the weather. It was a lie. I was looking for them. My fingers trembled as I pulled the edge of the curtain back, just a fraction of an inch. My world became a vertical slit of oppressive, featureless white. It was like staring at a blank page. For a moment, there was nothing. Just the fog. My heart began to slow. Maybe they were gone. Maybe the night was the trial and we had passed. Then I saw it. It wasn't moving, it was just there, at the edge of the woods, where the tree line should have been. A shape. It was tall, impossibly tall and slender, like a tree that had been stripped of its branches and stretched towards the sky. Its color was the faintest shade darker than the surrounding fog, making it almost invisible, a smudge on the lens of reality. Rule 6. If you see tall silhouettes in the fog, do not look directly at them. My gaze was locked. It wasn't a man. It wasn't an animal. Its proportions were subtly incorrect, the way a badly drawn figure is, with limbs that seemed too long and a torso that was too narrow. It had no discernible features. No face, no clothes, nothing. It was a column of wrongness, standing perfectly still. It wasn't hunting. It was just observing, waiting. They notice when they are noticed. The phrase slammed into my mind with the force of a physical impact. I ripped my gaze away, my breath catching in my throat. I let the curtain fall back into place, my heart hammering a frantic, painful rhythm against my sternum. I stumbled back from the window, a strangled gasp escaping my lips. I had looked right at it. Had it seen me? Had it noticed that it had been noticed? I turned to Caleb, needing to share the terror, to validate what I'd seen. But he was already looking at me. His empty eyes were fixed on my face, and for the first time since he'd come out of the bathroom, he spoke. His voice was a flat, dead monotone, devoid of all emotion. "You shouldn't have done that," he said. "Now it knows you're awake." Caleb's words were not a warning, they were a verdict. They landed in the dead air of the cabin with the finality of a closing casket lid. "Now it knows you're awake." The statement was delivered with no inflection, no fear, no concern. It was the detached observation of a naturalist commenting on the interaction between a predator and its prey. My friend was gone. The thing wearing his face was now just a commentator on my impending doom. My blood turned to ice water. Every instinct screamed at me to deny it, to call him crazy, to shake him until the real Caleb came back. But his eyes, they were the eyes of a man staring at a distant shore I couldn't see. The fear, the grief, the hope, it had all been scoured out of him, and what remained was a placid, terrifying emptiness. The reflection he'd seen in the medicine cabinet mirror hadn't just looked back. It had swapped places with him. "What are you talking about?" I demanded, my voice a ragged edge of panic. "What knows I'm awake?" He didn't turn to me. His gaze remained fixed on the middle distance, as if watching dust motes dance in a sunbeam that wasn't there. "The observer," he said, his voice a dry rustle of leaves. "You showed it you could see it. That's the first test. Intelligence, pattern recognition. Now, it will want to know more." His placid demeanor was 1,000 times more frightening than any scream. He was no longer a participant in this horror. He was a part of the scenery, a piece of the trap. I was utterly, completely alone. The silence that followed was a living thing, thick and suffocating. The only sounds were the incessant hiss of the radio and the frantic, shallow rhythm of my own breathing. I was trapped in a box with a ghost and a monster, and the box itself was floating in an endless white sea. Panic was a useless luxury. Action was the only antidote to madness. I needed an explanation, a history, a reason. I needed wisdom, and the only wisdom available was that of the dead, my grandfather. This was his cabin. These were his rules. He had lived with this, had somehow survived it long enough to die of old age. He must have known more. He must have left something behind. My gaze swept the cabin, frantically searching. Bookshelves filled with dusty westerns and fishing manuals, a cabinet of chipped plates, the worn-out furniture. Nothing, it had to be here. A lifetime of fear isn't something you just keep in your head. You write it down. You try to warn the future. My eyes landed on a large, dark wood trunk at the foot of the master bed, a piece I'd always assumed was for storing extra blankets. It was bound with iron straps and fastened with a heavy, rusted padlock. I scrambled towards it, my movements clumsy with desperation. "What are you doing?" Caleb's voice was flat, incurious. "I'm looking for answers," I grunted, tugging uselessly at the lock. It was solid. "Help me with this." "You won't like the answers you find," he said, without moving. I ignored him. In the kitchenette, I found a heavy cast-iron skillet. It would have to do. I returned to the trunk and began slamming the edge of the skillet against the lock. The sound was deafening in the silence, a series of violent, metallic shrieks. It was a desperate, primal act against the quiet that was trying to consume me. Again and again I struck, the metal of the lock groaning in protest. Finally, with a sharp crack, the rusted hasp broke. I threw the skillet aside, my hands trembling, and lifted the heavy lid. The air that rose from the trunk was a century old, a thick miasma of mothballs, brittle paper, and dry rot. Inside, beneath a layer of neatly folded yellowed linens, was a collection of my grandfather's things: a compass, a tarnished silver flask, a bundle of old maps, and beneath it all, a single leather-bound book. It was a hunter's journal. Its cover was worn smooth with use, the leather cracked and dark. I lifted it out. It felt heavy, not just with its own weight, but with the weight of the secrets it held. I took it back to the faint light near the window, my heart a frantic, fluttering bird in my chest. I sat down, my back to Caleb, and opened it. The first dozen pages were exactly what I expected: mundane entries written in a strong, clear script. September 14th, 1978. First snow on the peaks. The aspens are a blaze of glory. Tracked a bull elk for 2 miles, but the wind was against me. The silence up here is a balm for the soul. October 3rd, 1978. Bagged a decent buck. Filled the larder for winter. Weather turning. A strange fog bank settled in the valley last night. Had no temperature. My breath didn't mist when I stood in it. Peculiar. That last entry made me pause. Had no temperature. I read on, my pace quickening. The entries continued in this vein for a few more pages, a chronicle of a man at peace with his solitude and his environment. Then, the tone began to shift. November 29th, 1979. The fog came again, stayed for 3 days. The animals are gone, not hiding, gone. The forest is as silent as a tomb. Saw a doe at the edge of the clearing, standing stock still. It let me get within 10 feet. Its eyes were wrong, like black glass. It wasn't looking at me, it was looking through me. I didn't have the heart to raise my rifle. It felt like sacrilege. December 1st, 1979. The fog is gone. The doe is still there. Hasn't moved in 2 days. Not eating, not drinking, just watching. I am beginning to feel like I am the one in the cage. My hands were shaking as I turned the page. His handwriting was becoming tighter, more frantic. September 8th, 1981. It's not fog. Fog is water vapor. It moves with the wind. This moves against it. It has currents, eddies. It is not weather. It is a place. It is a habitat that overlaps with our own. I saw one of them clearly for the first time. The long shape at the edge of the trees. I thought it was a dead pine until it moved. It doesn't walk. It glides. I named them. The silent geometers. Their shapes are too simple, too perfect. They do not belong to the messy, chaotic geometry of nature. He called them the wrong name. Caleb's voice cut through the silence. I jumped, startled. I had almost forgotten he was there. I turned to look at him. He was still staring into nothing, a faint, almost pitying smile on his lips. They don't have names, he continued softly. Names are for things that can be known. I turned back to the journal, a cold dread coiling in my stomach. Caleb wasn't just broken, he was a mouthpiece. He was corroborating this madness from a place of terrible, first-hand knowledge. The next section of the journal was a list, each point obsessively detailed. It was the genesis of the rules on the pantry door. The rules of coexistence. 1. The boundary. The porch light is a demarcation, not a barrier, but a statement of territory. Inside this light, I am a known quantity. Outside of it, in the habitat, I am an anomaly. They are curious about anomalies. 2. The seal. They are not physical in the way we are. A locked door is a triviality, but it is a symbol of intent. It states, this space is separate, you are not invited. They seem to respect, or at least to be uninterested in, that which is deliberately closed off. 3. The mimicry. They learn. The voices are not hauntings, they are tests. They harvest sounds from the air, from our memories somehow, and play them back to gauge reactions. They are scientists testing a specimen. To respond is to confirm intelligence. It is the single greatest mistake one can make. It is to say, yes, I am here, I am thinking, I am aware. 4. The reflections. Mirrors are dangerous. A reflective surface is a flaw in the fabric of a single reality. It is a place where dimensions are thin. They can look through them. And if you look back, if you meet their gaze, they can reach through, not with a hand, with their understanding. They can pour what they are into you. It is a knowledge that scours a human mind clean. I slammed the book shut, my breath catching in a sob. Caleb. He had met their gaze. That's what happened in the bathroom. He had been scoured clean. The book fell from my lap, and I put my head in my hands, my entire body shaking. He was close, Caleb's voice murmured from across the room. The old man was clever. He watched them for a very long time, but he thought he was an observer studying them. He never realized they were the ones studying him. I forced myself to pick up the journal again. I had to finish. I had to know it all. I turned to the last two rules. 5. The camouflage. The static is auditory camouflage. The habitat is silent. The sounds of life, a heartbeat, breathing, the rustle of cloth, are deafeningly loud against that silence. The random noise of the static provides a shroud. It masks the sounds of a living, breathing organism, blending them into the background chaos of the universe. It helps one become uninteresting. 6. The invitation. Sight is an engagement. To look upon them directly is not just to see, but to be seen. It is an act of mutual acknowledgement. It is an invitation. You are signaling your awareness, your consciousness, and they are intensely curious about consciousness. To be noticed is to become the primary focus of their study. Their methods of study are invasive. My blood froze. I had looked. I had invited them in. As if on cue, a new sound began. It was a whisper. So faint, I thought at first it was the wind, but there was no wind. It was not one voice, but many, a soft, sibilant chorus that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the very air in the cabin. They weren't speaking words. It was a sound of pure mockery, a high, thin sound like the scraping of metal on glass. Then a single voice detached itself from the chorus. It was a clear, crisp whisper that sounded like it was right beside my ear. "She never loved you, you know," it whispered. "Sarah. She told her friends you were a placeholder, a comfortable habit she couldn't break." The air was punched from my lungs. It was a lie, a vicious, poisonous lie, but it was crafted from my deepest, most private insecurity, a fear I had never spoken aloud to anyone, not even Caleb, a fear that had festered in the dark corners of my heart after our breakup. They had reached into my mind, found the rawest nerve, and were now methodically dissecting it. I clapped my hands over my ears, but the voice wasn't outside. It was inside my skull. "You were always a disappointment to your father. So much potential, he'd say. And you wasted it all, didn't you? Just like you're wasting your life now." "Stop it," I whimpered, screwing my eyes shut. And then the whispers shifted their target. They turned their attention to the silent figure in the armchair. A new voice, this one colder and sharper, whispered a secret intended for me. "Ask Caleb what really happened on that bridge the night before his father died," it hissed in my mind. "Ask him why he was the one driving the car home. Ask him why he let his father take the blame for the dent in the fender. The argument they had, it was his fault." I stared at Caleb, my horror momentarily eclipsed by a jolt of shock. A secret. A real, plausible secret that recontextualized his entire year of grief. It was a masterful, devastating stroke, designed to shatter the last vestiges of trust between us. To isolate me completely, not just from my friend, but from the memory of him. I staggered to my feet. "Caleb," I choked out, "is that true?" Caleb lifted his head. The emptiness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a profound, ancient sadness. He looked at me, the real me, for the first time in what felt like days. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. "They learn so fast," he whispered, his voice trembling with the ghost of his former self. "First they mimic, then they observe, then they understand, and then they take things apart to see how they work." He looked towards the window, at the impenetrable wall of white. "The experiment has begun." The whispered secret about Caleb's past hung in the cabin's oppressive atmosphere, a poison that contaminated every molecule of air. It was a truth so perfectly, cruelly designed that it served two purposes: to eviscerate the memory of my friend, and to prove beyond any doubt the limitless reach of the intelligence that was now toying with us. My grandfather had called them scientists. He was wrong. Scientists are dispassionate. This was the work of vivisectionists, peeling back the layers of a soul not for knowledge, but for the sheer intellectual curiosity of the act. I stared at Caleb, at the single tear carving a clean path through the grime on his cheek. That tear was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. It was a fossil, a remnant of a man who no longer existed, a final reflexive spasm from a soul that had already been euthanized. "They learn so fast," he'd whispered. "First they mimic, then they observe. Then they understand, and then they take things apart to see how they work." He was a specimen that had already been dissected. Now it was my turn. "Caleb," I started, my voice failing me. I didn't even know what question I was asking. Was it true? Did it matter? The entity outside had made truth irrelevant. It could manufacture it, weaponize it, and destroy a life with it. Before I could form another word, something in the cabin shifted. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling. A subtle, nauseating lurch in my inner ear, the kind of disorientation you feel in a falling elevator. I instinctively put a hand out to the wall to steady myself. The wall felt wrong. The rough-hewn wood, which should have been solid and unyielding, felt strangely pliable under my palm, like cold, hard rubber. I snatched my hand back as if burned. "The geometry is unstable," Caleb stated, his voice a dispassionate murmur. He hadn't moved. "They're adjusting the interior dimensions to their own baseline. It makes observation easier for them." My heart hammered against my ribs. I looked down the short hallway that led to the bedrooms and the bathroom where Caleb had lost himself. It looked longer. Not by much, just by a few feet. It was an optical illusion, a trick of the dim light and my frayed nerves. It had to be, but it wasn't. I took a hesitant step towards it, my eyes locked on the closed bedroom door at the far end. With each step I took, the door seemed to recede, the hallway stretching like taffy. I took 3 steps, which should have put me halfway down the hall. I was still standing near the entrance, the door just as far away as before. My brain screamed in protest, trying to reconcile the input from my eyes with the feedback from my legs. The conflict was a physical agony, a spike of vertigo that threatened to send me to my knees. I scrambled back into the main room, my breath coming in ragged, panicked gasps. The cabin was no longer a shelter. It was a cage whose bars were bending, whose very blueprint was being rewritten by an unseen, alien architect. "They don't perceive space as a constant," Caleb explained, his tone that of a docent in a museum of horrors. "To them, it's a variable, a texture to be manipulated, like clay." The whispers started again, but they were different now. They weren't directed at me anymore. They were all around me, a multi-layered tapestry of sound. I heard fragments of conversations from my childhood, my mother's voice calling me in for dinner, the sound of my father laughing at a joke I'd long since forgotten. I heard the voice of my first girlfriend crying during our breakup, the exact words, the exact cadence. Memories, stripped of their context and emotion, were being played back into the air like random audio samples. My entire life was being sifted, analyzed, and catalogued. I looked at the fireplace, seeking a focal point, something real. The embers were still glowing, a soft orange pulse in the gloom. But there was no warmth coming from them. I stepped closer, holding my hand over the hearth. Nothing. Not a flicker of heat. I could see the light. I could see the faint shimmer of heat haze rising from the coals, but the sensation of warmth was simply absent. One of the fundamental laws of physics had been locally repealed. I turned my horrified gaze back to Caleb. "It's not real," I whispered, the words tasting like ash. "It's a hallucination. The fog, maybe there's some kind of psychotropic agent in it. Fungi, industrial chemicals." Caleb's head tilted, a slow, unnatural motion. "You think this is for you?" he asked, a genuine, chilling curiosity in his voice. "You think the universe is producing a play for an audience of one? This isn't a hallucination, Ethan. This is a lesson. They're showing you that your reality, heat, distance, time, memory, is nothing more than a set of locally agreed upon rules. And they don't have to agree. As he spoke, the static from the old radio on the bookshelf abruptly cut out. The sudden, absolute silence was a physical shock. In that void, a single perfectly clear word was spoken by the radio's tinny speaker. It wasn't a recording. It was a clean, synthesized, and utterly genderless voice. "Ethan," I cried out, stumbling backward and falling over an ottoman. The voice was cold, clinical, and precise. It was the sound of a pin being dropped onto a map where I was the sole landmark. The static crackled back to life, louder and more aggressive than before. I was being broken. Systematically, efficiently, my sanity was being dismantled piece by piece. The foundations of my world were being liquefied. I was a rat in a maze, and the god of this maze was a curious, patient entity that was growing bored of simply watching me. It was beginning to press the levers, and in that moment, something inside me snapped. It wasn't a descent into shrieking madness, but a sudden, terrifying clarity. It was a moment of pure, nihilistic rebellion. I was going to die in this cabin. My mind, my memories, my very identity. It was all going to be unraveled and discarded. The rules my grandfather had created were the rules of a mouse hiding from an owl. Hide, be quiet, be uninteresting, pretend you don't exist. But I did exist. I was here, and I was being tortured. Waiting for the end was no longer an option. Passivity was a death sentence, just a slower one. If my sanity was the price of admission to this horror show, I would at least choose the final act myself. I would reject the rules of the mouse. I would turn and face the owl. I got to my feet, a strange calmness settling over me. The fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in my gut, but it was now overlaid with a defiant, suicidal resolve. "What are you doing now?" Caleb asked, a flicker of something, perhaps a memory of concern in his dead eyes. "I'm breaking the rules," I said, my voice steady. I walked towards the main window, the one I had peeked through earlier, the one that looked out onto the clearing where I had seen the silhouette. I wasn't going to peek this time, I was going to stare. I was going to give it the invitation it so clearly wanted. My hands went to the heavy wool curtains. "That is a poor decision," Caleb stated. "The invitation, once offered, cannot be rescinded." "It's better than being taken apart in the dark," I retorted, my fingers clenching the fabric. I took a deep breath, and I ripped the curtains wide open. The world outside was a canvas of pure, churning white. The fog was a living entity, its tendrils swirling in slow, impossible patterns. For a long moment there was nothing else, just the abyss of white and the profound, crushing silence that came with it. I stood there, my heart pounding, my eyes scanning the featureless landscape, offering myself up. Here I am, I thought, the words a silent scream. "I see you. Come on. I'm looking. I'm interesting. Come and get me." And then I saw movement. From the depths of the fog, it emerged. The same tall, slender silhouette, but it was no longer lingering at the tree line, it was coming for me. It didn't walk, it didn't run. It flowed across the ground, a pillar of darkness gliding through the white, leaving no tracks, making no sound. It moved with a serene, horrifying grace, a thing for which friction and gravity were mere suggestions. I didn't move. I couldn't. My feet were rooted to the floor, my defiance curdling back into primal terror. But I didn't close my eyes. I had made my choice. The being flowed across the clearing and came to a stop directly in front of the window, no more than 3 feet away from me, separated only by a thin pane of glass. Now that it was close, I could see it more clearly. Its description in my grandfather's journal had been an understatement. It had no face, no features, no texture. Its surface was a perfect matte black that seemed to drink the light around it. It was a hole in the shape of a man, a physical absence given form. Its very presence felt like a violation of the laws of optics. It tilted its featureless head. It was looking at me. I was being seen, truly and completely, by something from outside the comprehensible world. And then it offered the invitation in return. There was no sound, no flash of light. There was only a sudden, catastrophic flooding in my mind. It wasn't a voice or a series of images. It was information. Pure, raw, unfiltered data poured into my consciousness. like a river of broken glass. I was suddenly aware of the true shape of the universe, a vast, unknowable structure of dimensions I couldn't name. I understood that human existence was less than a blink, a momentary accidental chemical reaction on a piece of cosmic dust. I felt the age of the entity before me, an age that made mountains seem like mayflies. It was not a creature, it was a consciousness that had existed before stars had names, a being for whom a galaxy was a brief, interesting pattern of light. I saw what it saw. I saw humanity as a brief, noisy culture of organisms trapped in a linear perception of time, obsessed with concepts so laughably primitive, love, hate, identity, purpose, that they were beneath its contempt. They were not even worthy of study. We were like ants building a hill over a sleeping god. Our entire existence was a footnote in its eternal silent observation of everything. The knowledge was not an attack, it was a gift, a terrible, soul-annihilating gift of perspective, the kind of perspective that makes madness a rational response. My legs gave out. I collapsed to the floor, my connection to the entity severed. But the afterimage was burned into my soul. The cabin, the fog, the rules. They weren't a trap or a prison. They were a nursery, a quarantine. A place to keep the screaming, ignorant children from wandering into the path of something so vast and indifferent that its mere passing could erase them from existence without ever noticing they were there. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I looked up at the ceiling of the cabin, at the solid, real wood that was nothing more than a temporary illusion, and I began to laugh. It wasn't the broken, insane giggle of Caleb. It was a deep, booming laugh of pure, unadulterated despair. The laugh of a man who has just been told the punchline to the cruelest joke ever written. The joke was existence itself. Across the room, Caleb watched me, his head tilted with that same analytical curiosity as the being outside. The ghost of my friend was gone forever. In its place was an assessor, a fellow specimen observing a new stage of the experiment. "Interesting," he murmured to the silent room. The first specimen was dissected. This one was enlightened. I wonder which is the crueler fate. My laughter echoed in the impossibly vast space of the cabin, a hollow, guttural sound that tore at my throat. It was the sound of a universe collapsing into a single, agonizing truth. The knowledge that had flooded my mind was not a vision or a hallucination. It was a pure, unvarnished insight into the cosmic indifference that truly governed reality. We were not even worthy of curiosity. We were irrelevant. Our lives, our loves, our fleeting struggles, they were less than the dust motes dancing in a sunbeam that wasn't there. I lay on the floor, gasping for air, the aftertaste of cosmic truth burning on my tongue. The entity outside the window remained, a featureless void that observed me with an ancient patience. Its silence was more profound than anything I had ever known, a silence that contained the unutterable wisdom of eons. "Interesting," Caleb murmured, his voice flat, devoid of the complex symphony of human emotion. "The first specimen was dissected. This one was enlightened. I wonder which is the crueler fate." His words pierced through the haze of my despair. He was no longer just an empty vessel. He was a conduit, a voice for the other. The being outside hadn't just broken him, it had repurposed him, and in that moment, I understood. Caleb hadn't been an experiment, he had been prepared. The chilling implications settled upon me like a shroud. If Caleb was prepared, then what was I? What role did the cabin play in this grand, horrifying equation? My eyes darted to the journal, still lying open on the dusty floor where it had fallen. My grandfather's frantic scrawl, his desperate attempt to rationalize the incomprehensible, to codify the rules of survival. But the rules weren't for our survival. They were for its convenience. I clawed my way across the floor, my muscles screaming in protest to retrieve the journal. My fingers, trembling with a renewed, sickening urgency, flipped through the final, brittle pages. There had to be more. There had to be a full explanation, a reason for this elaborate psychological torment. And then I found it. Tucked into the very back cover, almost missed, was a single folded sheet of paper, brittle with age and yellowed like old bone. It wasn't the strong, clear hand of my grandfather, nor the frantic, spiraling script of his later entries. This was a different hand, shakier, almost illegible, as if written by a dying man. My great-grandfather. My great-great-grandfather. The history of this cabin, of this particular horror, stretched back further than I had ever known. The paper unfolded with a faint crackle. The light in the cabin seemed to dim, as if the very air was holding its breath. I brought it close to my eyes, deciphering the fading ink, my mind already braced for the final devastating blow. The text was a revelation, a confession, a prayer from a long-dead man. November 12th, 1897. They call it the seam. My father called it God's tear. A weakness in the fabric. This land, this precise spot, is where the worlds touch. Not a portal, not a gate, but a thinness. A place where the rules are suggestions, not laws. Where the veil between what is and what is not is gossamer thin. The fog is not from here. It is the atmosphere of their world bleeding into ours. And the geometers, as the boy called them, they are its inhabitants. They are not malevolent, as we understand the word. They are simply there. Like the deep ocean to a jellyfish, we are a different chemical composition. They perceive us as anomalies, disruptions in their habitat. This cabin, it was not built by chance. It was built upon the seam, not as a sanctuary but as a ballast. My father discovered it. He built this structure not to protect us but to contain the bleeding, to hold the thinness in place, to prevent the fog from spreading. I felt a cold, liquid terror seep into my bones. Not a sanctuary, a ballast, a containment field. The rules, they are not for hiding from them. They are to stabilize the seam, to keep the geometers indifferent. When living minds are inside, attentive, aware, but quiescent, it creates a resonance, a focused consciousness. It acts as an anchor. The anchor holds the tear in place. It keeps their world from fully merging with ours. But the anchor, it needs fuel. It needs a mind, a human mind, constantly aware, constantly present, constantly being observed, and the minds, they burn out. The constant observation, the subtle manipulations, the sheer weight of what they come to perceive, it destroys them. They become empty, like the boy, Caleb, or they become knowing, like you, Ethan. Either way, they are no longer fit to anchor. The mind fails, the anchor loosens, the fog begins to expand. When an anchor burns out, a new one must be found, quickly, or the seam widens, the fog spreads, and the geometers, they come in. The cabin, it needs a new anchor, a new mind to hold the line, and if the current resident is no longer suitable, it chooses one of the available minds within the cabin. It has to, for all our sakes. The words blurred before my eyes. The current resident is no longer suitable. It chooses one of the available minds within the cabin. I looked up from the journal, my gaze snapping to Caleb. His face, usually so expressive, was still a mask of serene emptiness, but his eyes were filled with a profound, almost cosmic weariness. He was not just empty, he was used. He was a discarded shell, the fuel consumed. He was the anchor that had burned out, and I was the only other mind available. The last sentence of the ancient journal entry seemed to vibrate in the air around me, a chilling prophecy written in the hand of a long-dead relative. The old anchor has exhausted its purpose. The new one, it has been chosen, and it is already in place. As I read that final devastating line, the static from the radio, which had been a constant, monotonous hiss for days, abruptly changed. It didn't cut out, it swelled. It became a roar, a violent, chaotic torrent of sound that vibrated through the floorboards and rattled the windows. It was no longer just static, it was a scream, the sound of 1,000 realities tearing apart at the seams. Then, from the heart of that auditory chaos, a single perfectly clear voice emerged, cold as starlight, resounding through the cabin as if spoken directly into the core of my being. It was the same voice that had spoken my name from the radio earlier. The choice has been made. The transfer is complete. My head snapped up. I looked at Caleb. He was no longer in his armchair. He was standing perfectly still in the middle of the room. His head was bowed, his long hair obscuring his face. His posture was one of utter resignation, a silent surrender. The roar of the static intensified, reaching a crescendo that felt like it would tear my skull apart. The cabin itself began to shake, the timbers groaning, the glass in the windows rattling violently. The floor beneath my feet felt like it was rippling, shifting. The dimensions were collapsing, the seam was widening, and then Caleb lifted his head. His eyes were still empty, but they held a new terrifying luminescence. A faint cold light seemed to emanate from within them, not reflecting, but originating. And on his lips, a slow, impossibly wide smile began to form. It stretched, unnatural and inhuman from ear to ear, splitting his face with a silent, joyous vivacity that belonged to something ancient and utterly alien. His gaze found mine, and in that gaze, I saw it. Not Caleb, not the geometer. Something else. Something vast and terrible and old. And it was looking through Caleb's eyes. "Hello, Ethan," it said, not with Caleb's voice, but with a chorus of 1,000 whispers, perfectly synchronized, speaking through his mouth. The sound was deafening yet somehow intimate. "Welcome to your post. The anchor requires your vigilance." And as it spoke, Caleb began to walk. Not towards me, but towards the main door of the cabin, which was still locked and bolted. The door did not open. He simply flowed through it, the wood parting for his passage as if it were water, leaving no trace, no splinter, no sign of his impossible exit. He was gone. The roar of the static died down, replaced once again by the rhythmic, unnatural breathing I had heard days ago. The cabin stopped shaking. The light, which had dimmed, returned to its previous, oppressive grey. The world outside the window was still a pure, impenetrable white. I was alone. I was the anchor. I was the new post. My mind, once my own, was now a beacon, a living, screaming node in a vast, unknowable network of cosmic containment. My survival was not a triumph. It was the beginning of my true torment. I was trapped not just in this cabin, but in the terrible, consuming knowledge of my true purpose. I was a puppet, bound to a silent cosmic duty, cursed to watch the fog and wait for the next offering. And the profound, absolute emptiness where my friend once stood was a constant screaming reminder of the price of my salvation. For a long time after Caleb dissolved through the cabin door, I remained on the floor, adrift in the echoing silence. The only sounds were the faint, rhythmic breathing of the radio and the frantic, useless thumping of my own heart. The terror had not subsided, but it had transmuted. It was no longer a sharp, piercing fear of an external threat. It had become a part of my internal landscape, a vast and permanent feature like a mountain range or an ocean. The knowledge the geometer had poured into my mind was a psychic poison for which there was no antidote, and the silence in the cabin was the sound of it finishing its work. I was the anchor. The concept was no longer just words on a brittle page. It was a physical sensation. I could feel it, a subtle, persistent pressure at the base of my skull, a low-frequency hum that vibrated in my bones. It was the tension of the seam, the point where two incompatible realities were pressed against each other. My consciousness, my very sense of self, was the pin holding the two fabrics together. I could feel the immense, crushing weight of the other side, the silent, observing universe that my grandfather had so naively tried to catalogue. It was a constant, silent scream just beyond the threshold of my hearing. Slowly, shakily, I got to my feet. The cabin was the same, yet irrevocably different. The air was thick, heavy with a latent energy. The familiar objects, the stone fireplace, the worn armchairs, the dusty photographs on the mantelpiece, all seemed like props on a stage, their mundane reality, a fragile illusion. I walked over to the armchair where Caleb had sat and ran my hand over the rough wool of the blanket he had abandoned. There was no warmth, no lingering presence. It was just an object, a hollow space where my friend used to be. The grief was a distant intellectual concept, like reading about a tragedy in a history book. The part of me capable of such profound emotion had been cauterized by the truth. I spent what felt like an eternity in that state, a ghost in my own life, a warden of my own inescapable prison. Time had become a meaningless suggestion. The murky grey light outside the window never changed. There was no dawn, no dusk. There was only the perpetual, unchanging twilight of the fog. I did not feel hunger or thirst. I did not feel the need for sleep. The constant hum of the seam in my mind was a strange and terrible nourishment, sustaining the body while it annihilated the soul. Then, one cycle, I cannot call it a day, I noticed a change. The oppressive whiteness outside the window began to thin. It wasn't a natural dissipation, not the way fog burns off in the morning sun. This was a retraction, a slow, deliberate withdrawal, like a vast, pale creature pulling its tentacles back into the abyss. I watched, mesmerized, as the nearest pine trees began to resolve themselves out of the mist, their dark green branches emerging as if being painted into existence. The process took hours. Slowly, painstakingly, the world returned. The clearing, the forest, the distant, jagged peaks of the mountains. Finally, a pale, anemic sun appeared in a sky of washed-out blue. The fog was gone, but there was no relief. There was no surge of hope, no frantic scramble for the door. I knew with the certainty of a condemned man that this was not freedom, it was a change in the terms of my imprisonment. The fog had receded because the anchor was secure. My mind, now saturated with the terrible knowledge of what lay beyond, was a far more stable and effective anchor than Caleb's had ever been. The seam was sealed, for now. I finally walked to the door, my movements stiff and robotic. My hand hesitated over the deadbolt. I could leave. I could walk out of this cabin, get in my truck, and drive until the mountains were a distant memory. The thought was a hollow, academic exercise. I knew I couldn't. Leaving would be like a deep-sea diver shedding his suit at the bottom of the Mariana Trench. The pressure of the seam was held in check by my presence here. To leave would be to release that pressure, to allow the tear to rip open, to let the fog, the habitat, spill out and consume everything. My grandfather's family hadn't been guardians. They had been plugs in a cosmic dike. I opened the door. The air that greeted me was clean, cold, and carried the scent of pine and damp earth. It smelled like life. It smelled like a world I no longer belonged to. The forest was achingly beautiful, a masterpiece of chaotic, vibrant creation. But to my enlightened eyes, it was just a fragile, temporary arrangement of matter, a decorative film over the true, silent, geometric reality that lay beneath. The beauty of the world had become the most painful part of my curse. In the weeks that followed, I established a new routine, a routine of a man serving a life sentence for a crime he didn't know he was committing. I walked the perimeter of the cabin. I read my grandfather's journal again, this time not with fear, but with a profound, weary understanding. I saw the terror between his lines, the dawning realization of his role, and the desperate hope that the rules would be enough. They weren't. The rules were never for protection. They were a user's manual for the anchor. One evening, as the sun set and painted the peaks in strokes of blood and fire, I felt a new sensation, a flicker. The steady, humming pressure in my mind faltered for a fraction of a second. It was like a brownout, a momentary dip in power. A wave of dizziness and nausea washed over me. I gripped the porch railing to keep from falling, and I understood. The anchor burns out. My consciousness was the fuel, but it was a finite resource. The constant pressure, the eternal vigilance, the soul-crushing knowledge, it was eroding me. I was a battery, and I was being drained. My grandfather had not died of old age in a hospital bed. He had died here. He had burned out. And someone had replaced him. My grandmother? A visitor? The terrible calculus of the situation laid itself bare in my mind. The system was designed to be self-perpetuating. When one anchor fails, a new one is required. But how does a new one arrive at a remote cabin in the middle of nowhere? It must be brought. The previous anchor in its final days must ensure a replacement is available. It is the final, horrifying duty of the post, to lure a fresh mind, an unsuspecting soul, into the containment field before the old one fails completely. My grandfather hadn't just left me the cabin in his will. He had bequeathed me his damnation. I stumbled back inside, the full crushing weight of my legacy settling upon me. I was not just the prisoner. I was the bait. I was the Judas goat, destined to lead others to the slaughter to preserve a world I could no longer stand to be a part of. To refuse was to doom everyone. To comply was to become a monster. It was the cruelest choice imaginable, a cosmic trolley problem where the price of saving the world was my own soul. My eyes fell upon the journal, the history of my family's damnation. I now knew what I had to do. My story had to be added. The warning had to be refined. The trap had to be perfected. I found a pen and some fresh paper in a drawer, and I began to write. I wrote down everything that had happened, from the moment Caleb and I had arrived, to the impossible voice at the door, to the dissection of his mind and the enlightenment of my own. I wrote this confession, this explanation, this testament you are reading now. And when I was done, I took a fresh sheet of paper and rewrote the rules. My hand was steady, my script as cold and precise as the entity's voice. I copied the first 6 rules exactly as my grandmother had written them. They were essential parameters for the transfer. But my experience, the sacrifice of my friend, had taught me a new, vital piece of the mechanism. I added a 7th rule, a final, terrible piece of advice for whoever would come next. A rule born from the ashes of my friendship and the cold logic of my new reality. Never come alone. The sacrifice requires a choice. I took the new list and tacked it to the pantry door, right over the old yellowed one. It was done. My will and testament, my final monstrous act. And now my story ends. The telling of it has drained the last of my reserves. The humming in my skull is erratic, the pressure flickering like a dying candle. I feel thin, stretched, on the verge of becoming as empty as Caleb. The anchor is failing. Soon the fog will begin to bleed back in. A replacement is needed, urgently. I am sitting on the porch, the journal in my lap. The sun has set. The mountains are black silhouettes against a sky of impossible, starry clarity. It is beautiful, and I feel nothing. Then I hear it, a sound that does not belong here. The distant crunch of tires on the gravel road leading up to the cabin. Headlights cut through the darkness, 2 beams of brilliant, hopeful light painting the trees. They are coming. A friend I called from the old landline weeks ago. A friend I told I needed help, that I was in trouble. He's a good person. He brought his girlfriend along to help me pack, to make sure I was okay. He was always so thoughtful. They are here. A choice. I close the journal and place it on the small table next to the door, where it will be found. I stand up. A smile touches my lips. It is a dead thing, a rictus of pure, absolute resignation. I am no longer Ethan. I am the watchman. I am the bait. And I am so very, very tired. I raise a hand and wave into the approaching lights, a gesture of welcome, a gesture of damnation. The cycle, after all, must continue.